Winter 2023 started off the year with a bang, with over 50 new and continuing shows airing every single week from January through March, not to mention the 80-plus spring season that would follow. And while it isn't what many, myself included, would consider to have been one of the strongest seasons of anime in recent years, there were certainly a few gems scattered throughout the rest. Taking that into account, it seemed only statistically expected that many of these shows' soundtracks would also be great as well. And yet, in spite of all that, Revenger still managed to bring something that not only sounded amazing, but did many things that I rarely, if ever, hear in soundtracks of any sort. Now, to get some things out of the way early, the show itself wasn't one of my standout favorites from the season, nor did it really even leave much of an impression on me. My initial reasons for sticking with it were fairly superficial, the first being that I basically never seen non-World War II related stories set in Nagasaki and thought it was cool to see the city I live in depicted in its 19th century anime version, and the second being that I wanted to see what Urobuchigen was going to do with it. Fast forward to the end of the show, and my interest levels were basically unchanged, but what carried me through to the end was none other than the incredible music from a composer I'd never heard of, Futamata Jun. To understand some of the choices Futamata likely made when she composed the soundtrack, it's important to know a bit of the context behind the story of Revenger and the real-world geopolitical history of mid-1800s Nagasaki. At a time when Nagasaki was the only prefecture in Japan open to the rest of the world, Revenger is set during the same time period as the Opium Wars, two separate wars that ravaged China in the early and mid-19th century as the British and later French sought to expand the opium trade across Europe, Asia, and eventually the rest of the world. China's failed attempts to quell the spread of the drug from within and its retaliations against the British ships ultimately led to multiple major losses, including the forfeiture of Hong Kong. Given that Nagasaki was mainly trading with the Chinese and Dutch during Japan's closure, this nicely sets the scene for an opium-related entanglement at the end of the samurai era. Here we have the main theme, giving us a nice blend of different instruments and sounds to create a rather unusual sound texture. The track opens with a biwa solo, playing out a lonesome melody over some ominous East or Southeast Asian pot gongs and wooden percussive strikes. Note that this biwa could actually be its Chinese equivalent, a pipa, and either would make sense given the nature of the story and its setting. Assuming a biwa, this is highly fitting for the show, as the instrument is one that traditionally pierces the spirit world, bridging the gap between the corporeal and incorporeal, and is thus the reason it is an instrument for storytelling. The melody is languid and melancholic, freely reverberating without a set rhythm to lead the listener into a hypnotic lull. While this melody doesn't follow a strict time signature or tempo, it actually outlines the main musical motif. Ignoring some of the soloistic embellishments for a moment, this melody begins with a perfect fifth jump up from A to E, implying an A minor key signature. This is followed by a diatonic walkaround, going up from D to F, back down to B, and landing on the C. Taking this final C, we can treat it as the first note of the response to our initial call segment, utilizing a similar walkaround that ultimately ends on a low A to complete the full call and response. This A is then used to cue up the second part of the main melody, dropping down a third before jumping up to E and ending on D. The pattern is then repeated a diatonic step down, starting on the G natural and circling around to C. This then gets repeated again, but with a very unstable drop to the D natural, before a diminished run-up to leave us hanging, anticipating what will come after. While the biwa solo takes a few more liberties in how it operates around this skeleton, this is ultimately the figure that will shape every later iteration of the main theme's melody. A fifth jump up from the tonic, 2 descending walkarounds, 3 descending low and high steps, finishing with an unstable flat fourth before a diminished run-up into a long-held high note at the end. The biwa's actual playing style takes us into the dark setting of Nagasaki's opium-riddled underbelly. The non-specific rhythms and embellishments put us in a sort of hypnotic headspace, not unlike how those under the the influence of the drug find themselves in a heavy daze. Following this solo, a taiko section comes in with a heavy, uneven rhythmic structure, playing in measures of 6, 3, and 2, while some Zimmer-esque horn blasts carry us into the main body of the theme. A constant pulse and rhythmic pattern on the backing drums and percussion provide an ongoing sense of motion, while the main drum pattern stabs in with accented strikes to give the feeling of war and battle. This is an obvious representation of the more action-oriented side to Revenger, capturing the violent side of the story as Raizo and the Revengers carry out their assassinations on the brink of an international narcotics war. Suddenly, a solo violin pierces through, cutting away the drums as the supporting strings and low piano continue to outline our harmonies. This pure sound of the violin can easily be tied to Raizo, the protagonist of the series, finding himself entangled in the world of drugs and assassins after he was tricked into killing his to-be father-in-law. While the violin's line is quite closely based around the melodic skeleton we heard before, one of the most interesting things to note is its use of quarter tones, pitches that fall halfway between traditional chromatic notes. This not only gives the music a more unsettling feeling, as we viscerally hear that something sounds slightly off, but once again plays into the multicultural story and setting. Part of what makes quarter tones sound so strange to our ears is that, at least for those accustomed to Western and Western-inspired music, they don't typically appear outside of contemporary art music. There are, of course, exceptions in jazz, metal, and the occasional quirky soundtrack, but quarter tones are, for the most part, only found in the music of non-Western cultures. Now, looking at the few times the violin actually plays these, it is easy to assume that perhaps the musician simply wasn't in tune at this one particular section, but this seems not to be the case the moment the singer comes in with her interpretation on this melodic figure. Even ignoring the quarter tone moment, the style she is singing in is clearly not of Western origin, opting for something more breathy, throatal, and chant-like than what we might expect to hear in an anime soundtrack. For reference, compare these vocalizations near the end of the main theme to the singing heard in the OST's second track. Interestingly enough, this second track actually begins with the more chant-like singing, switching about halfway through to contrast the first half. Aside from simply being a fascinating blending of cultural styles into a single track, the use of this playing and singing style actually plays into Revenger's story and setting perfectly. What began as a pure biwa sound is suddenly taken over by the sounds of battle. Embroiled in the flames of war and drugs, the sounds become distorted from what we would have expected, instead taking on an unfamiliar style. This becomes more apparent in the second track, where the first half begins with the non-Western style of singing and switches halfway, this second half representing the relation the Revengers have to the church and its apparent purity. This is, of course, undermined by the distorted guitar and shamisen shredding happening underneath, but this only furthers the narrative of these clashing cultures and ideals. Of course, the show isn't all death, drugs, and Nagasaki's underworld from start to finish, and there needs to be some calmer music to depict less intense scenes. While there are some more standard calm pieces throughout the soundtrack, the piece playing now is a perfect example of how Futamata got creative with her less intense compositions. The track starts off simply enough, opening with some polyrhythmic clapping in 6/8. After 4 measures, the clapping is then accompanied by some bongos. Just listening, you might not notice anything odd going on at all, but in fact, with the entrance of the bongos, the rhythms have been altered, shifting from bars of 6/8 to alternating bars of 6 and 5. Before the listener has much of a chance to catch on to the new pattern, a guitar comes in, stealing our attention away from these odd rhythms. The rhythmic pattern continues, and as we begin falling into it again, a clarinet gets added in, once again stealing away our attention for a slightly disorienting melodic line that leaves a dizzying effect. These odd rhythms then become the norm as we're introduced to more complex melodic lines from both the clarinet and guitar. That is, until we realize that the pattern is actually switched back to straight bars of 6, replacing the bar of 5 we've managed to fall in rhythm with after nearly 2 minutes of awkward head bobbing and foot tapping. Odd time signatures certainly aren't a rarity in background music, and I wouldn't even say that this is particularly complex. Just listen to some of Bakemonogata's OST and you'll really get a sense of what can be done with odd rhythms and time signatures. What drew me so much to this one though was that it managed to pull off this strange effect without drawing attention to the rhythms as much as it did to the melodic lines. The clarinet and guitar's lines on top of the percussive elements feel very stable and, for lack of a better word, regular, never delving into territory that an untrained listener would feel something is off. The unassuming nature of removing one beat from what would normally be a pattern of 24 can be tied into the show as well, with the quirky cast of characters assuming normal lives by day while, appropriately for the music, picking off their targets from the shadows. I wouldn't necessarily say that this interpretation was planned by Futamata or the producers, but it's an interesting way to look at it, and if nothing else, is just an overall cool piece of music to jam out to. This final piece is probably best described as a culmination of what Revenger's OST is all about, and one that, while perhaps not directly, captures the overarching narrative of the story just as well, if not even better, than the main theme itself. The track is divided into 5 main sections, an opening on the biwa and some sort of double reed instrument reminiscent of a voice, perhaps a duduk or relatively low hichiriki, a highly rhythmic minimalist second intro section played on violin, piano, and xylophone, a Western-style voice-led section reminiscent of carnival music with its 3/4 accordion accompaniment, later supported by a theremin, a sort of sparser echo of the voice section pushed along by 2 flutes and a glockenspiel, and the final section, once again echoing the previous 2 but now filled out by a string quintet as the previously heard theremin takes on the main melody. I've talked about anime-related composers and performers' usage of interesting instrument combinations to create unique sounds and textures in their music before, notably Kotringo, Ushio Kensuke, Moriyama Naotaro, and Kevin Penkin to name a few. And yet, in spite of how each of them have wowed me with their music before, Futamata's blending somehow feels seamless, as if these strange combinations weren't actually weird until I started thinking about it more deeply. While I can't be entirely sure whether or not this phenomenon only applies to me, the ability to achieve this at all is impressive enough that, if it weren't already obvious, I think she's kind of a genius. For starters, this track, much like the main theme, begins in a pseudo-freeform style, only giving us hints at any perceived sense of rhythm and metering based on the timing of the biwa, reed instrument, and supporting winds. The next section then introduces a steady 3/4 pulse for us to follow all the way until the end, giving our first aspect to latch onto in terms of natural sound immersion. Despite the sections each taking on a vastly different character, this pulse keeps it together, but more importantly than the pulse, the melodic and harmonic material is more or less the same for the 3 major sections. With the intro sections giving us similar vibes to the main theme, our ears are already prepped to adapt to the sudden changes in mood, with the harshest shift, the accordion's entrance, taking all of 1 beat to get used to. And perhaps one of the more subtle tricks is the use of 2 instruments that, at least initially, could be mistaken for voices, tying them to the actual sung section. Of course, listening to the double reed instrument in the beginning and the theremin in the end with the knowledge that they aren't voices lessens this connection slightly, but ultimately this choice was only one small part of many that blends it all together. Revenger's music is great, something that I can't say for the show itself, but most definitely an element that helped boost my middling enjoyment. While soundtracks aren't often spoken about by the general audience, it's frustratingly common to see comments about how a show's overall quality is reflected in its soundtrack. Of course, this is understandable to a degree, as the viewer is less interested in the show and thus probably doesn't care about the music, an aspect that already gets overlooked most of the time. But with shows like Revenger, Shiki, and Akame ga Kill, yes, I will still defend Akame ga Kill soundtrack until the bitter end, all delivering such amazing soundtracks, it's high time we all start giving these composers the appreciation they deserve. While Revenger may have fallen a bit flat in terms of its overall quality, I'll still always be able to remember it in no small part thanks to its music and for introducing me to another fantastic composer I'd never heard of. I mean, the last time that happened was about a year before I recorded this video, with Seijo no Maryoku wa Banno desu introducing me Mitu Kuroda Kenichi. And like with him, I'm going to be on the lookout for any other shows that have Futamata Jun's name attached to them, and I'm really excited to see what else she has to show off. And now, even at the end of this, after all the praise that I've given to Revenger's soundtrack and all of the praise that I've sung for the things that Futamata was able to do, I'm really glad to say that it wasn't even Winter 2023's best soundtrack. So if you want to see what show's OST I thought absolutely stole the show for the season, make sure to let me know down in the comments below, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel. And if you want access to any of the transcriptions I've done for any of my analytical videos or voting rights on future video topics, make sure to go over and support me on Patreon. Thanks as always for watching, and I will see you in the next one.